In it here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
Welcome to the Legacy of Agriculture. This program will explore the past, present, and future of agriculture. We'll look at the people, products, and events that have formed its history. And now, with today's guest, your host, Chris Bair.
Good morning, everybody. I'm your host, Chris Bair of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate you joining us this morning. People are very, very busy, and it's always a treat to have people come on board and listen to the Legacy of Agriculture and what the show is about. In this week's Legacy of Agriculture, we're going to go down the history trail. We're going to talk about the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. And on the Legacy of Agriculture, on some shows we talk about current markets, on some shows we talk about history, and sometimes we talk about people's stories and their own histories or their families' histories over many generations. But this week, again, my good friend and coworker Josh Erickson and historian is joining us in studio here at the Pifer's office in our Worthing office just south of Sioux Falls to talk about the Dust Bowl days and what's going on with Josh currently and what he's doing. Thank you, Josh, for joining me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure to be back on the show. I always like getting that phone call because it's an excuse to do some more reading. So I think it's a lot of fun. Yeah.
I think you have the same, and I think I could call it an addiction. I absolutely love history. And the older I'm getting, there's more history that's stored in the top of my thick head. But I absolutely love history, and I love digging into history, especially history from the 1800s into the early 1900s, because there's so much going on there. And it's just interesting to see how people live and what was going on in their lives. In one of the first few shows that we did, we dug very, very deep into the history of barbed wire. If you remember that show, Josh, that we did together, and barbed wire was patented. It was invented in the mid-late 1800s, and it made its way into the plains. And during that period of time, settlers were moving from the east back to the west. There was the Homestead Act of 1862 that was passed by Abraham Lincoln that said, if you are a settler and you want to move into this new area of the United States, we're going to give you 160 acres. We're going to give you what we coin as a quarter of land. And you've got to go out there and you've got to earn a living. And when they got out there, of course, anything that is free is going to come with challenges. It's not like we're going to go out and get this 160 acres and we're going to build this big mansion. It was, we're going to get this 160 acres. We hope it's there. We think it's there, and we're going to take enough animals with us, or we're hoping to be able to buy or trade or barter for enough animals to put enough food on the table to eat till the next year. And then we're just going to see how it goes. But the problem with the Midwest, particularly down in what we call the Plain States, is that a lot of times it can be either very wet or it can be very, very dry. And droughts were very, very prevalent in that parts of the country. But the problem was there were so few people living down there that nobody really knew what the weather was going to do anyway. So if you had 2 or 3 years of wet, continuous weather, and the grass was good, and the grass was belly high to the cow, it has to all be good all the time, right? And it just wasn't that way. It would go through a few years of rain, which is usually less than 20 inches of rain a year, annual rainfall. And then sometimes you'd go into the drought years where there was almost nothing, and it just created a lot of problems. So having said all that, Josh, it kind of set the table for these settlers coming into the late 1800s and into the 1900s. And again, we talked about the Homestead Act of 1862, the end of the Civil War in 1865, and then the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. There began to be waves and waves of immigrants that were immigrating out into the Midwest and reaching the Great Plains. And so they decided, the government decided that rather than giving somebody 160 acres of ground, that they would give them a half section, which is two quarters is a half section of 320 under the Kincaid Act of 1904, and then eventually it gave them a whole section of ground. Mm-hmm. And into the early 1900s. So more and more people were coming, more and more people were moving into the Midwest. And our show today is going to talk mostly about Panhandle of Texas, southwest corner of Kansas, northeast corner of New Mexico, and the southeast corner of Colorado, and what that small area did and how it changed the face of agriculture, and also how it changed the face of what we would call the beginning of environmentalism. So Josh, you want to go into that just a little bit?
Yeah, I think like it's very easy to, when you read history, one of the joys that I find is trying to put yourself in the shoes of people who grew up at that time or who lived through those experiences. One thing that was required for people who are participating in the Homestead Act is an enormous amount of faith, right? You are moving out to this place, and it's not like today. If you buy land today, you can see video of it online. You can see drone footage. You can look through pictures, all that.
You can come look at it.
Yeah, and you have the ability to travel to it and travel back. You can fly from New York to South Dakota before you buy a parcel, right? But back then, if you were getting that land, it was sight unseen, and you kind of just hope there's not too many rocks to pick, right?
Yep.
So a lot of these people moving out, they really don't understand what the environment does. And advertisers back then were maybe a little shadier than they are now, right? They definitely knew that. While I was researching, I saw this quote, and I had to bring it up during the show. It's "rain follows the plow." So as people are moving in through the wet seasons and the waters come down, and they're like, wow, this is wonderful, productive land, and they truly believed that they had changed the environment around them, that their work in putting down corn or soybeans had created a new ecosystem, and that these dry years that they might hear about as they're moving in, those are a thing of the past because it's raining right now, and they don't have much of the experience with that nature. And so that's kind of the start of it. The idea that, right, the good times are going to keep being good forever. And they also had some new tech that was coming through the area, ripping up soil, that kind of thing. A lot of it was accidental, right? Farmers didn't really understand how the grass was keeping the soil down, that kind of thing. So when we start to get in talking a little bit more deeply about the Dust Bowl, we'll talk a little bit about like how plowing that up rips up some of that and how the grass was keeping all of that down. But a lot of it, I think, is still that a lot of the development of that area and the things that will lead into some of the Dust Bowl disaster is people who are hoping for a better life and just trying to make it work out on the farm. And so this is one of those rare instances where we can't really point fingers and say, well, they shouldn't have. They didn't know any better. Nobody did. And when people started to realize it, they started to kind of wind it back a little bit.
Yeah, that's you're right, Josh. And it was a tough time to be alive. There was a lot going on, but it was a tough time to be alive. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our first segment. We appreciate our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty. We'll be right back with our second segment.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Folks, we're back. I'm your host, Chris Bair, The Legacy of Agriculture, and my friend and co-worker Josh Erickson is joining us, and we're talking about the Dust Bowl days. In the first segment, we talked about a little bit of the history and the migration from the east to the west as European migrants were coming out into the Midwest under 3 different land acts that was allowing them to but just acquire free of charge either a quarter, half section, or a full section of ground, depending on what they wanted under which particular act, with the commitment that they stayed and farmed and that they developed that land. In the turn of the century, all this land obviously at one time was grazed. It was grassland, and with the invention of the plow, and we had a segment about the internal combustion engine. The internal combustion engine and the development and of tractors with an internal combustion engine, and kind of the moving away from the steam tractor was completely changing the face of agriculture. It was changing it very quickly. And with the invention of the tractor with an internal combustion engine plus the plow, they discovered that out here in the plains or down in the plains, they could plow, that they didn't need horses, they didn't need animals, they didn't depend on an animal's strength or its durability. Now we had a tractor that, as long as we were pouring enough gas in it, and as long as we could keep it fixed, and as long as we could keep enough oil in it, we could plow from daylight to dark. However, it was starting to create some environmental problems, and that's where the drought of the 30s, what they called the dirty 30s, started. As these sections of ground were now portions or large portions of them were starting to be plowed. And at that time, they had timely rains. The rains would come, it would keep the dust settled. But as what happens oftentimes in the lower Midwest, things dry out. Droughts come, there's no water or a limited amount of rainfall. Of course, the irrigation hadn't even been invented. There's no way to have flood irrigation unless you have a way to capture water in a reservoir and run it down a ditch. So that wasn't an option. So it was Mother Nature and the farmer, really out there in the middle of nowhere. And so when the drought came, that topsoil that had been tilled so heavily was starting to erode. And the philosophy back then is the deeper you plow, the richer the soil, the better moisture that you get for your spring planting, and the faster the seeds would come out of the ground, whether it was mostly wheat at that time, but they were growing some types of corn, and it just created, and then the winds came, and it just created a huge amount. Kind of tell us what happened after that, Josh.
Well, and so if you look at economics, which is always a fun discussion, after World War I, we're shipping a lot of food everywhere. And we're shipping a lot of everything everywhere, right? This is your roaring 20s, your flappers, all the life's a party, right? Americans are doing very well. But agriculture is it's an industry that's connected to every industry, but stuff that happens can be within agriculture, right? And what I mean by that is even before the dirty 30s, what kind of causes that is an economic downturn in agriculture. So I believe it's 1927. I might have the year off by 1 or 2, but I believe it's 27. We have a massive bumper crop of wheat, and that drives the prices down. Foreign markets are starting to recover from the war. All of a sudden, you don't have as much demand for American grains and vegetables, and that's driving the price down. Farmers with more capital into this new machinery, as your prices start to go down, they start to struggle to pay for stuff. And what do? They've got to make it work. You're on a farm in the middle of South Dakota, the middle of Oklahoma, and you've got a banknote to pay off. The solution is to work harder, right? Yep. So they go to work, right? Farmers are known for that. They start to expand.
That's how they made it.
Yeah.
Hard work. Rolled up your sleeves and went to work.
And they get after it. And they start to expand their fields. They start to rip up some more and more of that grass. They're trying to plant more and more plants that they don't know are going to do damage to the environment. And it's very important. Like, this isn't a matter of, farmers getting greedy. This is a matter of people trying to make ends meet. And it really is a little bit of a tragedy because of that. So they start ripping up this grass more and more, and then the dry season comes. And if you have lived in the Midwest, you know what it is to be windy, right? I don't know if the rest of the world really gets it. Across these open plains, it just howls, right? And so,
well, there's nothing to stop the wind.
Exactly.
There's no trees to speak of.
And so all of the sudden you have all this dry land, and now your winds are coming through, right? All of this land that is originally being held to the ground by grass is no longer being anchored there. It's got plants in, or it has been harvested, or it's still planting season, and you get a windstorm through. And it is picking up these massive, massive storms. I mean, I've seen photos during this research. You'll see a house, and I mean, you could stack 10 of them on top of each other. It still wouldn't reach the top of the clouds. And these dust storms, the wind that's coming through and picking them up is carrying it, I mean, for miles upon miles. So this Dust Bowl disaster that people see, it starts because people are just trying to go to work. And that's something that nobody really expected to happen. They didn't think that it would happen, because all they've experienced as they've immigrated to the Midwest is a rainy season. That's all they know. And so when this happens, the farm markets start to collapse. At the same time, in 1929, you have the collapse of the stock market, and here's the beginning of the Great Depression. What's interesting about that is they aren't linked. The stock market crash and the agriculture economic issues, they're happening at the same time, but it's not one causing the other. Instead, as this Dust Bowl is happening, right when farmers need a break, everything starts to go wrong in the world economy. And it starts in the United States, but it spreads to nations in Europe and other global markets. And the Great Depression really makes this disaster harder to deal with, because everybody is now down on their luck. It's not the farming industry that needs help. It's every industry that needs help.
Right.
And so I think later we'll probably talk a little bit about federal help and how they try to work against that. But it really is, it's a unique event in history. And to this day, the Dust Bowl is classified, at least according to the article I was reading, as the largest man-made ecological disaster in history. Right? And all of it started, like I said, simply because people are trying to do the right thing.
To kind of draw a map of how serious this is, and unfortunately on radio and Spotify and Apple and all of these platforms, you can't have a visual. But if you go back and you read the history books and you look at the pictures, these piles of dust that moved, those of us that live in the upper Midwest that are familiar with snow, when we get a blizzard that comes in and you have 5 or 6 foot drifts, you got two choices. You either move them mechanically with a shovel or a skid steer or a wheel loader or whatever it is. We have snow plows out on the road that are plowing snow off the road, and we can move them. But when you look at these pictures from this Dust Bowl area, as hard as the wind was blowing, it created these dust drifts that were just as deep as what we get sometimes in the Midwest.
Tractors buried, fence lines buried.
Yeah, you would put in a brand new fence line, and as the wind would blow across the plains, you'd have tumbleweeds or sagebrush or wherever there was anything that would stop the wind or slow the wind, the dirt would pile up there, and it was absolutely devastating to a lot of those farms, and and completely destroy the farm in some instances, because you didn't have the mechanized muscle to go back out and to just level everything off. So the problem of hurting and damaging not only the environment, but it was damaging all of the work that these immigrants had put into moving out into the Midwest and making this all happen.
I think it's a testament to Americans and to Midwesterners specifically that anybody can get through something like that.
Yeah. You're 100% right on that, Josh. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our second segment of the Legacy of Agriculture. We appreciate our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction and Realty, and we'll be right back with our third segment.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Hey everybody, this is your host of The Legacy of Agriculture, Chris Bair. We're back in our third segment, and my guest today is Josh Erickson. Thank you again, Josh, for joining us. And we've had a very, very good, brisk conversation in our first two segments about the drought and the Dust Bowl days of the 1930s and how that was affecting agriculture. And at this point, we were talking about the environmental side of how it was affecting these farms, the soil drifts or the dirt drifts that were coming as a result of that. But I want to talk a little bit in this segment about how it was affecting animals and human beings that were out on the plains. And in our segment, or last fall, we had a show, Barry Grossenberg was on, and we were talking about the cattleman's blizzard that happened about 10 years ago out in the Dakotas. And during that show, we talked about that the cattle didn't necessarily die from the depth of the snow. They didn't necessarily die from the cold. And there was thousands of head of cattle that died in the Dakotas. They died of suffocation. And what would happen is as an animal the size of a cow, how they would suffocate is if they can't find shelter, they have a tendency to wander. And what they would do is they'd wander into a fence line, or they'd wander into a tree row, or they would wander into a pond or something, and as they were breathing and the cold and the wind would swirls around a large animal, their respiratory system would fill with ice. And actually what would happen is that as they would breathe out, it would heat the snow and the cold, and as they would breathe in, it would freeze. And eventually it would frost, fill their nasal passageways, their sinuses, and their bronchial airways with ice and snow and suffocate, and just basically kneel down and die from suffocation. It's kind of unpleasant to think about, but it draws a picture of how harsh the Dust Bowl days was on animals, but also on human beings, because here in modern day, when a blizzard comes in, we have a tendency to open the windows, turn up the furnace, turn the television on, and watch television, and we sit in a home that is safe. As long as the power stays on, we've got all of the niceties in life that we can enjoy. And some of us sometimes look forward to a good blizzard because we don't got to go to work, right? Yeah. Or we don't have to go to church on Sunday, or we could just shut the world off, and technology allows us to be entertained. We're okay. But back in those days, a lot of these homes were mud homes. Mm-hmm. They were homes that were built out of what they had in front of them. There was an abundance of trees that they could just build a lumber home. They built their homes in the side of a hill. They would build them out of mud. They would have straw roofs, and that wind and that dirt, when it was blowing that hard, would fill their homes up with dirt and dust, and they would actually have to shovel that dirt out of their homes so it didn't fill their homes up. But the other thing that was happening was as the dirt and the dust was affecting those immigrants and those people just like they have affected cattle. A farmer or producer or rancher would go out to check his cattle to see if they even had water, and he would come home, he would come inside, and he would die from suffocation because his lungs would fill up with dirt, and the moisture inside your lungs would turn to mud and would basically suffocate.
They called it, they thought it was like a type of unique pneumonia to the time, and it especially affected the elderly and young children.
Very young children.
Yeah, and it was a serious problem that people weren't equipped to face. But those medical issues were only exacerbating the problem. You're already trying to deal with the fact that markets are down, that dust is everywhere, and now your cow dies, or now you're dealing with the horrible loss of a relative, right? These are difficult times.
Or even the birth of a child. There was no such thing as a hospital or a clinic, or maybe there was a doctor that would come around once in a blue moon and check on you. So any child that was born in these horrific conditions, a lot of them just died.
And what I find particularly interesting, having grown up in farming country and getting the pleasure to work with farmers, is that there is an attitude of, this is bad, I guess that's what we're handling. And that's how a lot of people got through this, is that you're facing all of these different challenges, and your only option is to learn how to handle it. And I think what's maybe a hair inspiring to see is that attitude has continued down the years. You talk about the cattleman's blizzard, that's 10, 15 years ago, something like that. And a cow is out in the field and a cow freezes to death. And that is horrible for a farmer. But what do? You deal with it. You find a way to get by. And so there is a little bit, your show is the legacy of agriculture. That is something that has been passed down to people here in this part of the world. And I think that the Dust Bowl and those tough times, it breeds a tough attitude, an attitude of helping your neighbor. And I think that's largely still true here today. I think in this part of the world, that's largely still the case.
And I think you're right. My mom always used a word called grit, and I was raised with that word grit. What kind of grit you got in you, and back in those days, and we've talked about this many times in the show, it took between 85 to 90% of the population in the United States to produce enough crops to feed the United States. So basically everybody's feeding themselves, other than probably 10, 12, 13% of the population, where today it's less than 2% that's growing enough food to feed the United States. So this was a matter of survival for almost all of the population in the United States was agriculture.
And when tough times hit agriculture, when you see stuff like a global pandemic, for a non-specific example, it's nice to see that that's still around, that people are still going to figure it out, right?
Yep, that's exactly right. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our third segment. Wanting to shout out to our sponsor, Pfeiffer Auction Realty and Land Management, for sponsoring the Legacy of Agriculture. We're going to be right back with our fourth segment.
Hey, this is Jasmine at Pfeiffer's Auction Realty and Land Management. Pfeiffer's offers multiple ways to bid and buy at our equipment and land auctions. You can bid online, in person, or place pre-bids before the sale even starts. By providing convenient bidding platforms, we make sure that you can buy the items or parcels you want the way you want to. Visit Pfeiffers.com to see a complete list of our auctions. When it comes to bidding, go with Pfeiffer's. Nobody does it better.
Good morning, everybody. This is your host of the Legacy of Agriculture, Chris Bair. We appreciate you joining our show and listening. If you don't have a chance to listen to it on the radio, on WNAX AM 570, you can go to Apple or Spotify and get all of our recorded episodes of the Legacy of Agriculture. We're getting pretty close to our 50th episode, Josh. That's pretty incredible. It seems like we just started.
It does, and that means 50 means we're only 2 away from rounding a year. We're almost at our annual anniversary.
That is for sure. But Josh Erickson is here. He's a historian and also a fellow co-worker at Pfeiffer Auction Realty, and I appreciate him joining. We're talking about the Dust Bowl days, Josh. We were talking about what was present in the Dust Bowl era, the boots on the ground, the immigrants that had come and turned farmer, turned rancher. Technology was allowing us to have mechanized horsepower to plow and to plant, and it changed the face of the Midwest. And the Transcontinental Railroad was in, roads were being built, and people were coming into the Midwest. But as the Dust Bowl days hit, it created a disaster, a natural disaster that lasted quite a few years. There were some interesting turns of events that happened, and we read in history a lot about black clouds, and we in our last segment we talked about the devastating effects that it had on human beings and on animals. But there were some things that needed to change. Let's talk about that, Josh.
Yeah. So we also, in our first segment, we talked about how people didn't know what was happening. What it took was a lot of folks who actually know what's going on, right? The people who they see all of this process that's occurring throughout the country and they go, okay, that's wrong. We need to do something different. And one of the names that's very important for that is our friend Hugh Bennett. If you haven't heard that name, that's again Hugh Bennett. He is essential in starting to kind of stop this disaster from getting worse and then implementing some policies to start making it better. So Hugh was a person who studied soil. He understood how dirt works, how it moves throughout the countryside, and he realized that the thing that was causing this problem was the type of farming that was going on and was a lack of protections in place for that type of farming. And so he goes to the government and he decides to tell them, look, guys, we've got
He goes to Congress.
at a Senate hearing, and he's chatting with them and he's trying to get them to change policies. And he's trying to get them to start implementing some of the things that you'll talk about a little later in this section. And so he wants to try and shift the way we're plowing some of that soil, try and get some grasslands to stay around, that kind of thing, and try and start getting these dust clouds under control. But he's dealing with people who maybe don't experience what's going on in the Midwest. Their lives are in Washington or Virginia or way up in, Oregon. They don't understand the problem. So there's this story that I actually really enjoyed reading about. He's testifying before the Senate on this problem, and they're kind of dragging their feet about if it's an issue and if they want to actually do something or if we really need to put policies in place to try and protect people. And he was studying all of these patterns, and he knew that a storm was coming. He was tracking it on his own through telephone calls and making sure that he knew where
Telegraph.
and where this storm is going. So he stalls. He, filibusters. He kind of drags his own feet so that he can drag this session out an extra day. And then during that day, everybody's in the Senate chamber. He's testifying. And
So basically what's happening through this dust storm, it was picking up all of this dust back in the Midwest. It carried over to the top of Chicago and some of these great big cities. And communication wasn't allowing people to really experience it till it got there, and so many people didn't know what it was.
Yeah, a lot of these senators, they hear about dust storms and they think it's a little bit windy. They haven't been to the Midwest. And so it's not their fault either. But he stalls and he stalls and he stalls, and then the next day it starts to get a little dark in the Senate chamber. And a man pokes his head out the window and he sees this massive black cloud, this black blizzard is what they would call them, coming through. And Hugh Bennett said, according to the source I read, "Gentlemen, that is Kansas blowing past." And that's all of a sudden, legislation starts to move a little bit more quickly. The wheels get a little greased. Now people are like, oh, this is a real problem. We need to handle that. And so I'll let you talk a little bit. I think you know the rules a little bit better than I do about some of the policies that went into place, but without, and this is one of those fun moments in history, without the intentional action of one person, we could still be facing part of that disaster. This region could still be dealing with a lot of the consequences of the Dust Bowl. But one person who knew what was happening in the environment and was willing to put in the effort and was willing to do his research and work for farmers, he was able to make a difference. And not enough people know about him.
I wish that we had the time to go into depth about some of the legislation that got put in place, but unfortunately we're getting close to the end of our fourth segment, and maybe we need to do a podcast about how that changed. But that really was, in my opinion, was the very beginning of environmentalism in a positive way, not in a negative way, but in a positive way, is that we had created this environment out in the Midwest, not because not because a group of people were saying, I hate the environment and I'm going to, they were doing it as a means of survival. Yeah. And it needed to be corrected and needed to be fixed. And really, environmentalism definitely has its place everywhere.
I was talking with your land manager out of the Sioux Falls office, Tim Peters, and he talks about managing your most precious resource. I think that if you talk to farmers, they want to care for the land, right? Finding the best way to do that is really the goal.
That's exactly right. You're exactly right, Josh. But through the studying that we've done about the Dust Bowls of the Dirty 30s, it almost gives me shivers down my back to think about how great agriculture is. That's one of the main reasons why I'm doing the Legacy of Agriculture, is as so many of these stories are being lost in history. We have you talk to a family, you go out onto a farm that's been fourth, fifth generation family that is now being acquired, or they're selling their land, or the family is we did a land auction this spring that this family had bought and owned a piece of several sections of ground here in South Dakota before South Dakota was ever a state. And that's a long time. Yeah. That they could go back when they did the abstract, they could date that right back to when they had acquired that land before South Dakota ever became a state. But lots and lots of history, and I wish we had the time to go more in depth about the Dust Bowls, but unfortunately we don't. Folks, we're coming down to the end of our fourth segment, and again, Josh, thank you very much for joining us on the Legacy of Agriculture. I'm sure that you're going to be back.
Well, thanks for having me back. It's always a treat.
I heard you're moving back from Kansas City back to God's country here in South Dakota.
There's nothing wrong with being in corn country by my standard. Yes, sir.
You learned some lessons down in Kansas City, didn't you?
Yeah.
So, all right, folks, thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. For all of our archived podcasts, you can go to Apple or Spotify, and now we're on YouTube. Join us there. This is Chris Bair, your host of the Legacy of Agriculture.
In here now, what are you gonna do now? I'm gonna bid on here now. Who bid $500,000 bid?
We hope you've enjoyed today's edition of The Legacy of Agriculture with Chris Bair, sponsored by Pfeiffer's Auction, Realty, and Land Management. Call Pfeiffer's at 605-836-2277.